The town hall in Shreveport, Louisiana, buzzed softly with murmured conversations and the scraping of folding chairs against the polished floor. Families, retirees, and curious locals filled the modest church fellowship hall, a space usually reserved for Sunday potlucks and Bible study. At the front stood Donald Trump, his familiar presence unusually subdued. Amid the crowd, 8-year-old Lily sat quietly, clutching her late grandmother's worn leather-bound Bible. Dressed in her best Sunday dress, she listened intently, her small hands gripping the treasured book. Her mother's whispered encouragement lingered in her mind as she prepared to ask her question. Lily sat quietly, her small hands gripping the edges of her grandmother's worn leather Bible. The hall was filled with murmurs and shifting chairs as the town hall progressed. Donald Trump spoke about policies, achievements, and the future of America, but Lily barely heard any of it. Her heart pounded in her chest, her rehearsed question echoing in her mind. She had practiced it for weeks, scribbling it down in her notebook at school, whispering it to herself before bed. It wasn't a question born from simple curiosity. It carried weight, something deep inside her that she needed to understand. Her mother had told her, "You can ask him, but only if you're brave enough." And now, the moment had arrived. When the floor opened for questions, eager adults lined up, asking about local issues, policies, and even complimenting Trump's signature red tie. Lily hesitated. She felt impossibly small among the crowd of grown-ups. She shrank back into her seat, gripping the Bible even tighter. But then her mother gave her a subtle nudge, a silent reminder. She took a shaky breath and stood. Her legs felt wobbly, her hands clammy. The line ahead of her seemed endless, but as she moved forward, something changed. Conversations quieted. People began to notice the small girl with the oversized Bible clutched tightly to her chest. A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. By the time it was her turn, the room had grown silent. Trump's gaze softened as he looked down at her. "And what's your question, young lady?" His voice, usually commanding, was unexpectedly gentle. Lily swallowed hard. Her fingers tightened around the Bible, her knuckles turning white. She felt every pair of eyes in the room on her, but she didn't back down. Taking a deep breath, she steadied herself and finally spoke. "Mr. Trump," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "what does God mean to you?" A hush fell over the hall. The air felt heavy, thick with anticipation. Every rustling paper, every shifting chair, every whispered conversation ceased. The weight of her question pressed down on everyone like an invisible force. For a man known for his quick answers and sharp comebacks, Trump didn't respond immediately. He just looked at her, then at the Bible in her hands. Something in his expression changed. The bravado faded. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his answer. The moment Lily's question left her lips, the room fell into absolute silence. Every conversation stopped, every shuffle of a chair ceased, and even the air itself seemed to still. For the first time that evening, Donald Trump, known for his quick wit and rapid-fire responses, did not immediately answer. Instead, he simply looked at her, his gaze shifting from her wide, expectant eyes to the Bible she clutched so tightly against her chest. Something about the question, so simple yet so profound, seemed to catch him off guard. His usual confident demeanor softened, his expression shifting into something rarely seen. His lips parted slightly as if to speak, but no words came. He hesitated, and that hesitation was felt by everyone in the room. It was an unusual sight. Trump had built his reputation on always having an answer, always knowing what to say. But in that moment, there was no immediate comeback, no polished response. Instead, he seemed to be searching perhaps for the right words, or maybe even for the answer itself. The weight of Lily's question pressed down on the room, heavier than any policy discussion or political debate. This wasn't about polls, campaigns, or headlines. It was something deeper, something real. The sincerity in Lily's voice had cut through all the noise, leaving only this moment of quiet introspection. Trump's eyes flickered across the audience, as if gauging their reactions, but no one moved. The people before him, families, retirees, working-class citizens, weren't just waiting for an answer. They were experiencing something rare, the sight of a man known for his unshakable confidence standing in quiet reflection. His fingers tapped lightly against the podium. He took a breath, as if steadying himself. His expression wasn't one of evasion, nor was it the carefully rehearsed composure of a seasoned public speaker. Instead, it was something raw. Vulnerable. For Lily, the silence stretched on endlessly. Her small frame seemed even smaller under the weight of the moment, yet she didn't waver. She had asked not to challenge, not to provoke, but to understand. And somehow, that honesty had brought the entire room to a standstill. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Trump raised his hand slightly, as if grounding himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, steadier, different. "That's a big question," he admitted, and the room seemed to exhale, leaning in to hear what would come next. Trump took a deep breath, his fingers resting on the edge of the podium as he steadied himself. His usual commanding presence had softened, replaced by something far more reflective. He glanced back at Lily, her wide, unblinking eyes fixed on him, waiting for an answer. The weight of her question still lingered in the air. "That's a big question," he said finally, his voice quieter than before. "And it's not one I've always had the answer to." The admission surprised many in the crowd. Donald Trump, a man known for his unwavering confidence, was admitting uncertainty. But as he continued, his tone carried something deeper honesty. "When I was about your age," he said, looking at Lily, "I had a lot of questions about God too. My parents took me to church every Sunday. I remember sitting in those pews, staring up at the stained glass windows, wondering if God was even listening to me." A faint smile crossed his lips, as if recalling the image of his younger self, restless in the wooden pews, trying to understand something beyond his reach. The audience remained silent, hanging on his words. "My father used to tell me," he continued, "that faith is like a ladder. You climb it one step at a time, and sometimes you're afraid you'll fall. But you keep climbing because there's something up there worth reaching for." He paused for a moment, his gaze distant, as if picturing his father's face. "At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. I thought it was just something he said to keep me quiet." A few soft chuckles rippled through the audience, momentarily breaking the heavy silence. But Lily didn't laugh. She remained still, waiting for the real answer she had come for. Trump leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. "But as I got older, life threw challenges my way. I faced losses, failures, moments where I wasn't sure if I could keep going. In those times, I didn't always feel like God was with me. Sometimes, I was angry at him. Other times, I thought maybe he had given up on me altogether." The room remained captivated. This wasn't a rehearsed campaign speech or a well-crafted soundbite. It was raw, real. "But I'll tell you this," Trump said, his voice firming. "Even in my worst moments, when I thought I was alone, I realized faith isn't about always having the answers. It's about believing that, even when you don't see the whole picture, there's a purpose. There's something greater at work." Trump's expression shifted again, his usual commanding presence giving way to something softer, something almost vulnerable. He took another deep breath, his fingers gripping the edge of the podium as he looked out at the crowd. Then, after a moment of hesitation, he spoke. "When I was a young man," he began, his voice lower now, "there was a time I thought I had it all figured out. I had ambition, plans, and the drive to succeed. But there was one moment in my life, just one, that made me realize how little control I actually had." The crowd sat in complete silence. This wasn't the typical rhetoric they were used to hearing from him. This was something different. "My brother Fred," Trump continued, "was one of the kindest, most genuine people I've ever known. He had a light about him, a goodness that I couldn't quite understand at the time. His voice faltered for just a second, and he cleared his throat before going on. But Fred struggled. He had his demons. And no matter how much my family and I tried to help him, it wasn't enough. The weight of those words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain. Lily, still clutching her Bible, stared up at him with quiet understanding, as though she already knew what was coming next. When he passed away, Trump said, his voice steady but filled with something deeper, I was angry. Angry at him. Angry at myself. And angry at God. He exhaled, looking down for a moment before continuing. I couldn't understand why someone so good, someone with so much potential, had to leave this world so soon. It didn't make sense. Lily's grip on her Bible loosened slightly. Around the room, faces reflected the weight of his words, some nodding in understanding, others swallowing back emotion. For a long time after that, Trump admitted, I turned away from God. I thought, if he was real, why would he let that happen? Why would he take someone like Fred and leave me behind? The weight of Trump's words lingered in the air, the whole still wrapped in silence. But then, a rustling near the back broke the moment. A man, rugged and weathered from years of hard work, slowly raised his hand. The crowd turned as he stood, his expression serious yet thoughtful. Mr. Trump, he said, his voice strong but measured. I've spent years trying to figure out my own faith. Hearing you talk about it like this, about anger, doubt, and hope, it makes me wonder if all of us have been too afraid to admit we're struggling. Do you think that's part of the problem? Trump considered the question, nodding slightly. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the podium. You know, he began, his voice quieter now, I think a lot of us are afraid to admit we're not as strong as we want people to think we are. Faith isn't easy. It's messy, complicated. Sometimes, it feels like you're shouting into the void. But the truth is, that's what makes it so powerful. It's not about being perfect. It's about trying, even when you don't have all the answers. The man nodded, his expression softening as he sat back down. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Then, a familiar voice rose Lily's. She spoke with a newfound confidence. My grandma used to say faith is like planting seeds, she said. You don't always see them grow right away, but you have to believe they will. Trump smiled, something genuine and warm in his eyes. Your grandma sounds like a very wise woman, he said. And she's right. Faith is a seed. It doesn't always sprout the way you expect, but that doesn't mean it's not there, growing in ways you can't see. A moment later, an elderly woman, her silver hair pulled neatly into a bun, raised her hand. Her voice trembled as she spoke. I lost my husband last year, she said. I've been angry at God ever since. I feel like I've lost my faith entirely. Do you think it's too late to find it again? Trump's expression softened even more. He stepped closer to the edge of the stage. It's never too late, he said. Faith isn't something you lose forever. It's something that waits for you. And sometimes, in the quietest moments, when you least expect it, it comes back. The woman nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. Across the room, others dabbed at their faces, some lost in quiet reflection. The hall, once just a space for political discussion, had transformed into something deeply personal, a shared moment of vulnerability and understanding. Trump took a deep breath, scanning the room. You know, he said, there's something I've learned over the years. Faith doesn't always show up in grand moments. It's in the small ones. The times when someone lends a hand, listens when you're hurting, or asks a question as brave as Lily's. Those moments remind us of what really matters. He turned back to Lily, his voice steady but warm. This little girl reminded me tonight that faith isn't just something we talk about. It's something we live. And when we live it, it spreads. A ripple of applause began, slow but growing. People stood, clapping not just for Trump, but for the moment itself, for Lily's courage, for the stories shared, for the reminder that faith, despite struggles and doubts, had the power to bring people together. As the applause faded, Trump leaned in one last time. "So tonight, I'll leave you with this," he said. "Ask yourselves what faith means to you. And don't be afraid of the answer, no matter how uncertain it might be. Because faith isn't about knowing, it's about believing." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Then, with a final nod, he added, "And if you found something tonight that touched you, hold on to it. Let it grow. And share it with the people who need it most." The room erupted into applause once more. But this time, it wasn't just clapping, it was hugs, handshakes, quiet exchanges of understanding. Strangers who had arrived with only polite nods now lingered, talking, reflecting. Trump stepped away from the podium and walked over to Lily. Kneeling slightly, so they were eye to eye, he spoke softly. "Thank you, Lily," he said. "You've got more courage than most people twice your age. Don't ever lose that." Lily, her small frame no longer trembling, extended her hand. "Thank you, Mr. Trump," she said. "For answering." Trump smiled faintly, before turning back to the crowd, waving as he exited. The room, though beginning to empty, still buzzed with something unspoken, a shared understanding that, for one night, something deeper had connected them all. Lily turned to her mother, her voice quiet but certain. "Grandma would have been proud, wouldn't she?" Her mother smiled, her own eyes glistening. "She would have been more than proud, sweetheart. She would have been amazed.